There comes a moment in life when you realize that not every battle needs your voice, not every misunderstanding needs your explanation, and not every person deserves access to your emotions, and in that moment when you choose silence over reaction, calm over chaos, and dignity over drama, something powerful begins to shift in the unseen, because silence is not weakness, it is not fear, it is not surrender. It is a message so strong that it echoes in the hearts of those who once thought they had control over your responses, and when you stop arguing, stop chasing, stop proving, and stop defending yourself against people who already decided not to understand you, your silence becomes a mirror that forces them to confront their own noise, their own insecurity, and their own assumptions, and suddenly the energy changes, because they were prepared for your reaction but they were never prepared for your stillness. They were ready for your anger but they did not expect your calm, they anticipated your pleading but instead they encountered your peace, and that peace unsettles them more than any words ever could, because silence removes the game, it ends the performance, it closes the stage where manipulation once thrived, and when you step off that stage without announcement, without drama, without a final speech, your absence becomes louder than any confrontation you could have delivered. And people begin to feel what your presence used to cover, they begin to sense the emptiness that your energy once filled, they begin to question the confidence they had when you were reacting to them, because reaction gave them reassurance, your response validated their importance, your defense confirmed their influence, but your silence tells a completely different story. Your silence says I no longer need to prove myself, your silence says I trust the truth to stand on its own. Your silence says I am no longer available for chaos disguised as connection, and when you understand this, you stop feeling guilty for not replying, you stop feeling pressured to explain, you stop feeling responsible for managing other people's misunderstandings, because maturity teaches you that clarity does not always come from speaking louder, sometimes clarity comes from stepping back and letting reality reveal itself without your interference, and this is where your growth becomes undeniable. Because anyone can argue, anyone can defend, anyone can shout their perspective, but it takes strength to remain composed when provoked. It takes discipline to hold your peace when disrespected. It takes wisdom to recognize that not every invitation deserves your attendance, and when you decline that invitation with silence, you protect something sacred within yourself, you protect your mental stability, your emotional balance, your spiritual alignment. And the beautiful part is that silence exposes intentions in a way arguments never can, because when you stop engaging, the other person is left alone with their motives, and without your reaction to feed on, those motives either dissolve or reveal themselves clearly, and this is why silence feels uncomfortable to people who rely on control, because they cannot control what does not respond, they cannot manipulate what does not react, they cannot predict what remains steady, and your steadiness becomes a boundary that does not need to be announced, it is felt, it is understood, and it is respected even by those who pretend not to notice it. And the more you practice this kind of silence, the more you realize that peace is addictive, that calm becomes your default setting, that your nervous system no longer jumps at every notification, every comment, every subtle shade thrown your way, and instead of being pulled into emotional turbulence, you observe, you breathe, you detach, and in that detachment you discover power, because power is not in overpowering others. Power is in mastering yourself, and silence is one of the highest Forms of self-mastery. It is the art of knowing when your words will add value and when they will only add volume. It is the discipline of choosing dignity over ego. It is the understanding that your worth does not decrease simply because someone fails to recognize it. And when you fully embrace this, your silence transforms from a coping mechanism into a strategy. It becomes intentional. It becomes deliberate. It becomes a language of self-respect, and people begin to interpret it whether you explain it or not, because silence communicates standards, it communicates boundaries, it communicates finality, and sometimes the loudest message you can send is the one that requires no sound at all. And as time passes, those who once misjudged your quietness as weakness begin to realize that your silence was strength under control, that your calm was confidence in disguise, that your distance was discernment. And by the time they understand it, you have already evolved beyond the need for their understanding, because your growth was never dependent on their awareness. It was fueled by your decision to stop participating in cycles that drained you, and this is the true transformation, when you no longer seek closure from conversations that never offered clarity, when you no longer chase validation from people who withhold appreciation, when you no longer argue with those committed to misunderstanding you, and instead you channel that energy inward, building yourself quietly, healing yourself privately, strengthening yourself consistently, and in that quiet rebuilding, your life begins to shift in ways that require no announcement, because the results speak, the glow speaks, the peace speaks, the success speaks, and suddenly the same people who once overlooked you begin to notice the difference, not because you told them, but because silence allowed your actions to take center stage. And actions amplified by silence carry a weight that noise never achieves, and you start to see that not every victory requires applause, not every comeback requires explanation, not every elevation requires permission, and in embracing silence, you detach from the addiction to external reactions. You stop measuring your impact by immediate responses, you stop equating attention with value, and you begin to understand that some of the most powerful moves in life are made quietly, strategically, patiently, and when you reflect on your journey, you will notice that your greatest growth did not happen during loud confrontations, it happened during quiet reflection, during nights when you chose not to send that message, during mornings when you decided not to check that profile, during moments when you felt the urge to respond but instead chose restraint, and that restraint built resilience, it built emotional intelligence, it built a version of you that is no longer easily shaken. And this version of you moves differently, speaks less but means more, engages selectively, invests intentionally, and protects energy fiercely, because you now understand that energy is currency, and silence is how you manage that currency wisely. And while the world may glorify constant expression, constant sharing, constant noise, you have discovered the elegance of quiet confidence, the sophistication of calm strength, the undeniable authority of composed presence. And that authority does not beg to be heard, it simply exists, steady and unbothered. And the beauty of this journey is that your silence not only transforms how others see you, it transforms how you see yourself, because every time you choose peace over pettiness, you reinforce your own self-respect. Every time you decline chaos, you confirm your maturity. Every time you remain silent in the face of unnecessary conflict, you affirm your growth. And over time this consistency builds an inner foundation so strong that external storms lose their impact, and you no longer feel compelled to correct every false Narrative, because you trust that truth has endurance. You no longer rush to defend every rumor, because you know that character reveals itself through time, and you no longer fear being misunderstood, because you understand that not everyone is meant to understand you, and this acceptance is liberating. It frees you from the exhausting cycle of over-explaining, oversharing, overextending. And it guides you into a season of intentional living, where your words are chosen carefully, your circle is curated thoughtfully, and your silence is preserved purposefully. And in this season you will witness something remarkable. You will witness how distance clarifies relationships, how absence tests loyalty, how quiet exposes authenticity, and you will realize that silence is not about punishing others, it is about prioritizing yourself, it is about creating space for alignment. It is about protecting your peace so that when you do speak, your words carry weight, your voice carries authority, your presence carries respect, and by then you will no longer need to raise your volume to be heard, because the power of your silence has already spoken loudly enough. And as you continue walking this path of intentional quietness, you begin to notice something even deeper unfolding within you, because silence is not only speaking to them, it is also speaking to you. It is revealing the parts of yourself that were once addicted to reaction, the parts that sought validation through arguments, the parts that equated attention with affection, and when you sit in silence long enough, you start confronting your own patterns with honesty. You start recognizing how many times you responded not because it was necessary but because your ego felt challenged. How many times you explained yourself not to clarify but to be chosen. How many times you fought to be understood by people who were never listening in the first place. And this awareness becomes transformational because it shifts your focus from controlling the narrative outside to mastering the narrative within. And once that shift happens, your silence becomes peaceful instead of painful, it becomes empowering instead of heavy, it becomes a conscious decision rather than a forced withdrawal, and this is where your real strength begins to stabilize, because now you are not silent out of fear of conflict, you are silent out of clarity of purpose. You are not quiet because you feel small, you are quiet because you know your worth does not require constant advertisement, and when you operate from this level of self-awareness, people can feel it even if they cannot articulate it. They sense that you are no longer easily triggered, no longer easily accessible, no longer easily influenced, and that subtle shift in energy changes the dynamics of every relationship around you. Because when you stop reacting the way you used to, others are forced to confront a version of you they do not fully understand, and what people do not understand often makes them uncomfortable, because your unpredictability disrupts their expectations, your calm disrupts their strategy, your silence disrupts their control, and instead of engaging in the familiar cycle, you remain steady, grounded, observant, and that observation becomes your advantage, because silence allows you to see patterns you once ignored, it allows you to hear tones you once excused, it allows you to notice inconsistencies you once rationalized, and with this heightened awareness, your standards naturally rise, your tolerance for disrespect lowers, your patience for confusion diminishes, and without announcing it, you begin to outgrow environments that once felt normal, and growth often feels lonely at first because not everyone evolves at the same pace. But in that loneliness you discover self-sufficiency, you discover that your peace does not depend on constant communication. You discover that fulfillment is not tied to constant engagement, and as this realization settles in, your silence becomes lighter, it becomes liberating, because you are no longer using it to prove a point, you are using it to protect a principle, and that principle is self-respect, and self-respect changes everything. It changes how you respond to delayed replies, it changes how you interpret mixed signals, it changes how you handle rejection, because when you truly respect yourself, you no longer chase clarity from people who create confusion, you no longer beg for consistency from those who thrive in inconsistency, you no longer exhaust yourself trying to decode behavior that clearly lacks intention. Instead you step back, you observe, and you allow actions to speak for themselves, and in doing so, you eliminate the need for unnecessary confrontation, because clarity often reveals itself when you remove your voice from the equation. And sometimes the silence between you and someone else becomes the loudest answer you were searching for, because if someone truly values your presence, your absence will disturb them enough to act, but if your silence goes unnoticed, that too is information, and information is power when you choose to interpret it wisely rather than emotionally, and this is where emotional maturity blossoms, because you begin to respond to patterns instead of promises, to consistency instead of chemistry, to effort instead of excuses. And silence gives you the space to evaluate all of this without pressure, without distraction, without noise, and the more comfortable you become with that space, the less you fear losing people who were never aligned with your growth, because you understand that not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay. Some are lessons, some are reflections, some are temporary chapters that teach you discernment. And silence is often the closing sentence of those chapters, not written in anger but written in acceptance. And acceptance brings peace that arguments never could. Because arguing tries to change minds, but silence accepts reality, and reality, when accepted, becomes easier to navigate, and as you continue embracing this approach, you may notice that certain people attempt to provoke you back into reaction, they may test your boundaries, they may throw subtle comments, they may attempt to re-enter your life through nostalgia or convenience, but your silence has already taught you something invaluable. It has taught you to pause before responding, to evaluate before engaging, to consider long-term peace over short-term satisfaction, and that pause is powerful, because within that pause you choose who you are becoming instead of who you used to be, and every time you choose composure over impulse, you reinforce your evolution, you solidify your transformation, and you prove to yourself that growth is not about being louder, it is about being wiser, and wisdom often whispers instead of shouts. It observes instead of interrupts, it moves strategically instead of emotionally, and when you embody that wisdom, your silence no longer feels like emptiness, it feels like depth, it feels like stability, it feels like confidence that does not require constant reassurance, and the remarkable thing about this level of silence is that it eventually commands respect even from those who misunderstood it, because consistency reveals intention. And when people see that your quietness is not temporary mood but permanent maturity, they adjust their behavior accordingly or they distance themselves naturally, and either outcome works in your favor, because both create alignment, and alignment is what your soul has been seeking all along, not chaos, not drama, not emotional roller coasters disguised as passion, but steady, healthy, intentional connections that honor your energy rather than drain it, and silence filters for that alignment in ways words cannot, because words can be manipulated. Promises can be exaggerated, but silence exposes authenticity over time, and time always reveals truth, and when truth reveals itself, You no longer need confrontation, you no longer need revenge, you no longer need the last word, because the last word becomes unnecessary when the lesson is learned, and that is the quiet victory of silence. It wins without applause, it resolves without spectacle, it transforms without announcement, and as you continue forward, grounded in this understanding, you begin to realize that your silence was never about shutting down, it was about leveling up. It was about stepping into a version of yourself that no longer negotiates with disrespect, no longer bargains with inconsistency, no longer entertains confusion, and this version of you moves differently, thinks differently, chooses differently, and speaks only when words align with purpose, and because of that, when you finally do speak, people listen more closely, because your voice has become rare. Intentional, meaningful, and rare things are valued, intentional words are respected, meaningful presence is appreciated, and all of this began the moment you understood that your silence is not empty space, it is powerful communication, it is emotional intelligence in action, it is strength under control, and as you carry this awareness into every area of your life, from relationships to career to personal growth, you will continue witnessing how powerful it is to remain centered in a world addicted to noise, because while others rush to defend, to argue, to prove, you remain steady, observant, and composed, and that composure becomes your signature, your protection, your elevation, and the louder the world becomes, the more your silence will speak, and as this journey continues, you begin to understand something even more profound, that your silence is not just changing how others see you, it is redefining how you experience life itself, because when you stop reacting to every external trigger, you create space to respond from intention rather than impulse, and that space becomes sacred. It becomes the ground where clarity grows, where confidence stabilizes, where identity strengthens without the need for constant external confirmation, and you start noticing that situations which once disturbed your peace now barely move you, words that once demanded explanation now feel insignificant, and people who once had emotional access to you now stand at a distance. Not because you built walls out of bitterness but because you built boundaries out of wisdom, and there is a difference, because walls are built from pain while boundaries are built from self-respect, and your silence has helped you understand that distinction clearly. It has shown you that protecting your energy is not rude, that choosing not to engage is not arrogance, that walking away without a speech is not weakness. It is alignment, it is maturity, it is growth that no longer needs applause to feel valid. And when you operate from this level of grounded awareness, you stop trying to correct every misunderstanding because you realize that people committed to misunderstanding you will always find a reason, and instead of exhausting yourself in endless explanations, you allow time to reveal character. Because time exposes intentions far better than arguments ever could, and the beautiful thing about silence is that it forces accountability without confrontation. It allows others to sit with their own words, their own actions, their own assumptions, and in that stillness truth becomes unavoidable, and whether they admit it or not, they feel the shift. They recognize that the version of you who once reacted instantly is gone, replaced by someone composed, observant, intentional, and that quiet transformation unsettles those who benefited from your previous emotional availability, because now your energy is selective, your attention is earned, your presence is intentional. And as you continue moving forward in this refined state, you realize that silence is not about avoiding conflict forever, it is about choosing meaningful battles wisely. It is about speaking when it adds value and remaining quiet when it preserves peace, and this balance becomes your power, because now when you do speak, your words carry weight. They are not rushed, not reactive, not emotionally scattered. They are measured, thoughtful, and grounded, and people listen differently because your voice is no longer common, it is intentional. An intentional presence commands respect naturally, and ultimately you come to peace with the understanding that not everyone will understand your silence. Some will misinterpret it, some will project onto it, some will feel challenged by it, but that is no longer your responsibility, because your responsibility is to maintain your alignment, to protect your growth, to nurture your peace, and as long as your silence is rooted in clarity rather than fear, in strength rather than suppression, in wisdom rather than avoidance, it will continue to speak louder than any argument ever could, and in that realization you find freedom, because you no longer need to be heard to feel powerful, you no longer need to be validated to feel worthy, you no longer need to react to feel relevant. Your stillness becomes your statement, your composure becomes your confidence, and your silence continues to speak in ways that words never will. And as you step even deeper into this evolved version of yourself, you begin to notice that silence is no longer something you use only in moments of tension. It becomes a lifestyle, a mindset, a quiet confidence that follows you into every conversation, every opportunity, every relationship, and instead of feeling the need to announce your growth, you embody it. You walk into rooms without trying to dominate them, you listen more than you speak, you observe more than you assume, and this awareness gives you an advantage that loudness never could, because while others reveal their intentions quickly, through constant talking, you gather insight through calm attention, and insight is power when handled with discipline, and over time your silence refines your discernment. It teaches you who is genuine without them saying much, who is consistent without them promising much, who values you without you asking for proof, and this clarity protects you from repeating old cycles, because now you recognize red flags earlier. You recognize emotional immaturity faster, you recognize manipulation before it fully unfolds, and instead of confronting every issue dramatically, you simply add just your access, you limit your availability, you redirect your focus, and that quiet redirection speaks volumes to those paying attention, because nothing confuses people more than losing access to someone who no longer reacts, and in that loss of access they are left to reflect, to question, to reconsider. And whether they grow from it or not is their journey, not yours, because your journey has shifted toward stability, toward intentional living, toward building a life that does not require constant explanation, and the more you honor your peace, the more opportunities align with your energy, because calm attracts clarity, composure attracts respect, and self-control attracts trust, and eventually you realize that your silence was never about making others feel your absence. It was about helping you feel your presence more deeply. It was about reconnecting with your intuition, your standards, your purpose, and when you are fully present within yourself, you no longer fear being alone, you no longer fear being misunderstood, you no longer fear missing out, because you understand that what is truly aligned with you will not require you to abandon your peace to maintain it, and so you continue forward, steady and unbothered, speaking when necessary, silent when powerful, detached when needed, engaged when meaningful. And in this balanced rhythm you discover a truth that changes everything, that the loudest power you will ever carry is not in how strongly you argue your worth but in how calmly you uphold it, not in how quickly you respond but in how confidently you withhold, not in how much noise you create but in how much peace you preserve, and from this place of grounded certainty your silence no longer feels like something you are doing, it feels like who you have become. A person whose presence commands respect without demand, whose absence teaches lessons without revenge, whose stillness speaks louder than chaos ever could, and that is the quiet mastery that transforms not only how the world sees you but how you see yourself.